Okay, welcome again to everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on building informational reading skills in elementary grades. Before we start, just quickly introduce myself. I am Lyneis. I am the curriculum director for literature, social studies, and science for the kindergarten through fifth grade. I have taught for quite a few years all over the country, and I'm incredibly passionate about reading education and making sure that kids are developing into lifelong readers. So this curriculum project and everything that we're going to talk about today is something that I'm very passionate about. So excited to have you all here today to listen and learn what we're doing here at Match Fishtank. Match Fishtank is an online platform where you can view, share, and download the curriculum that we are using here at our Match Charter Public School in Boston. And currently we have K through 12 courses in math, ELA, science, and social studies. And today we're going to predominantly talk about our science and social studies courses in K through 5. So we're going to cover three main things in the next hour. The first thing we're going to talk about is the importance of background knowledge and how that frames our curriculum and the work that we are doing with informational reading. And that sort of pairs with our key features of our approach. And then we'll spend some time digging into how you can use our curriculum to build informational readers. So one of the most important things that we've realized and is at the foundation of our work is that for comprehension, knowledge matters, and it's the most important thing. I can remember back to when I began teaching, and I was very focused on teaching reading skills, and I'd teach main idea, and I would do lots of main idea worksheets, and I would think that, great, we've mastered main idea, but it's actually the exact opposite. When kids need to have access to content knowledge and background knowledge in order to use those reading skills. And so we really focus on teaching reading skills through sustained immersion in high quality background knowledge in science and social studies. So if you look at this graph, this is something that kind of illustrates this point. There was a text given to a group of middle schoolers that had required the background knowledge about baseball. And the strong reader who understood baseball scored the highest on the assessment. But then what was interesting was that a reader who may have been a weak reader, so if we were just testing their main idea skills, may not have been strong at main idea, but knew a lot about baseball, actually scored higher than a strong reader who did not know as much about baseball. And this reinforces our idea that when kids have content knowledge, it makes them stronger readers. And so content knowledge is as important, if not more important, than teaching reading skills without background knowledge. And so these are just some other quotes that sort of like build at this idea that background knowledge is incredibly important in terms of building strategic readers. Without a broad knowledge, children's reading comprehension will not improve. And so we can, if we want to set out on this path of in creating kids who love to read and who are deep readers and who are understanding the world around them, the most important way for us to do that is by exposing them and building their background knowledge. And this only happens through class periods and a curriculum that cohesively builds this content knowledge, not just in isolation, but over several class periods and over the course of the entire day. It's not enough to say, today I'm going to teach my kids about butterflies, tomorrow I'm going to teach them about frogs, the next day I'm going to teach them about Martin Luther King. It all needs to be part of a coherent progression that helps kids make sense and actually deeply grapple with the background knowledge. And this is incredibly important also for low-income children who often come into school with a lower background knowledge than their peers. And so this is what they need to help increase their reading skills and understanding of what they're exposed to and when they're reading. This also ties directly into content knowledge, and vocabulary go hand in hand. In real estate, they say it's all about the location, location, location. In reading and vocabulary development, it's all about context, context, context. And children learn new words best when they're learned in context. And so if they're interacting with words in a familiar context, they learn them 4 times faster than if it's an unfamiliar context. So for example, if we were looking at a second grade unit on insects, words that they might see are characteristics, exoskeleton, metamorphosis, and species. If you asked any second grade, if you did one lesson with those 4 words and then asked any second grader the following day if they remembered what those 4 words were, very unlikely that they would be able to use those words and have them be part of their natural vocabulary. However, if they spend 3 weeks, 4 weeks deeply involved in a unit on the insects, where every day they're talking about characteristics, every day they're talking about the role of the exoskeleton, every day they're talking about species, by the end of that unit, they will deeply know those vocabulary words in connection with the context knowledge. So we fully believe that the best way to develop vocabulary is through this deep topic immersion and consistent instruction of it over time, and not just randomly exposing kids to vocabulary knowledge. So with all that said, that sort of gives a background to why we at Match decided to focus on informational reading and building content knowledge as the focus of our science and social studies curriculum in the elementary grades. So we fully believe that background knowledge is essential to reading comprehension. It's the core of everything we do. Reading strategies and background knowledge go hand in hand. We also fully believe that teaching informational reading through content knowledge is also empowering students to become their own advocates of their own learning, and teaching students how to read to learn and find topics that they're interested in and know how to explore and build understanding through reading, because that's what they've been doing in class as they've been going through these systematic units and reading to learn and figure out new information. We also find that this approach of teaching informational reading through content knowledge has increased the engagement within our classrooms, both from teachers and from students. Our teachers find that being able to deeply dive into a unit on the American Revolution, something that they may have been passionate about themselves, that excitement and drive that they bring to it for 3 or 4 weeks helps the kids build that excitement and that deep understanding of the content. And for kids, it also gives them a chance to see what they're interested in and learn about the world and dig deeper into things that they may have thought they knew about already, or things that are completely new to them. So for all of those reasons, we firmly believe that a focus on content knowledge is the best way to teach informational reading. With that, the key features of our approach within our curriculum, as we just said, the content knowledge is the most important one. For those of you that have had a chance to sort of play around on our site, you'll see that we dive into quite a few different topics, and we'll show you those in a second. And I think the thing that's important with content knowledge is that content knowledge needs to expose kids to a wide variety of topics, and there are, in both science and social studies. For science, we have based most of our content knowledge off the next generation science standards, which Massachusetts has slightly adapted, but the core of our science units come from the reading and understanding behind the next generation science standards. For social studies, our background knowledge began through core knowledge, but then we sort of branched out in order to reach the needs of the population that we serve. And so I think it's important with content knowledge to think about your location, think about things that are important to the groups of kids who are in front of you, and in things that interest them, while also making sure that they're learning some of the things that are important for them to learn about and their understanding of the US and the way things are now. But content knowledge is at the heart of everything. Some of the other things that we feel very passionate about in our approach is the informational text. So we learn all of our content, the majority of our content knowledge, through informational text. Over the course of a kid's stay with us at Match from kindergarten to 5th grade, they're exposed to a wide variety of informational text, a lot of narrative nonfiction, scientific technical text, historical text, first texts that are written in the first person, texts that are texts, texts that are historical documents. And so kids see a lot and are exposed to a wide variety of different texts, which allows them to see the power of informational reading outside of just the one informational genre that they might feel most comfortable in. We also use in a lot of our lower grades and some of our higher grades a fair number of science A to Z text as transitional text for some of our lower grades as they start to switch from doing read aloud into more shared reading and independent reading, because the texts have a lot of the features of nonfiction texts that help support their understanding of the content before they're ready to grapple with some of the more dense texts that they see in third, fourth, and fifth grade. But all of our units are focused around core texts and then the supplemental texts that support them. Another big part of our approach is project-based learning. We fully believe that kids being able to deeply engage with the content, either in a culminating task or in projects along the way, is the way that kids will fully internalize the content that they are learning. Sometimes reading can turn into sort of a passive activity for kids, but when they're forced to turn around and reteach it or explain it or synthesize something within a project, they have to be much more active participants in their own learning. And that's when they're able to synthesize everything that they've learned and use the vocabulary that they've learned. And that's when they internalize the content. We are still trying to figure out what this looks like in science and the best way to do this in science. And so this is something that our teachers are spending a lot of time this year sort of exploring on where the project-based learning fits in order to get kids to deeply engage with the content. Is it at the end? Is it at the middle? But we firmly believe that it should be in there, regardless of where it is over the course of the unit. The other things that are important to our approach is word knowledge. As we spoke about earlier, we fully believe that there is a connection between background knowledge, vocabulary, and strong informational readers. So we spend a lot of time building content-specific word knowledge that's related to the subject matter that kids are exposed to. And then finally, we place a pretty heavy emphasis on discussion. We think that discussion is one of the ways, again, sort of like project-based learning, to get kids to synthesize and grapple with the content that they are learning. If a kid is able to read and then debate and convince other people of the information that they have learned, they're deepening their understanding of the content. And so our kids engage in a lot of whole class discussions, small discussions with partner to partner, discussions in small groups, but these are happening constantly within our classrooms in order to build the content knowledge. So across our curriculum and across our schools, these are the things that are at the core of how we teach informational reading. With that said, over the course of our kindergarten through fifth grade science and social studies curriculum, students dive into 6 to 7 topics per year. And as you can see here, here's a broad overview of the topics that exist currently within our units. Kindergarten only has one reading block, and so their informational reading happens within their literature block as well. Whereas in first grade, second grade, third, fourth, and fifth grade, it's a separate block that kids have every day where they are learning and digging into one of these subject matters. A lot of the subject matters, as you can notice, build from year to year and rely on the background knowledge and understanding that the kids built in kindergarten to move on to first grade, or in fifth grade, the stuff they learn in fourth grade is important for their understanding in fifth grade. That does not mean that the units cannot be used if they haven't been taught from kindergarten and fifth grade. The units themselves can be taught as standalone, but they also, if taught as a cohesive whole, give a lot of opportunity for kids to continue to tap back into their memory of the things they've learned previously in connection to what they're learning in the next grade. And we've seen that kids really like that and being able to make sense of sort of what they being held accountable for holding on to their background knowledge is also part of this whole piece of making sure that we're not just teaching it to them, but they're remembering it and learning it and feel like they're in charge of their learning. And so that by scaffolding things from year to year, it helps kids make those connections. So we're going to take a look at what this looks like on Match Fishtank. And so I'm going to open up the Match Fishtank site and show you sort of how we have put together our philosophy and our approach into a website where we are sharing our information with you. So what we have right now in front of you is our broad, our homepage. So when you log on to Match Fishtank, this is what shows up. And when you scroll down, you'll see that here are all of our available courses. And on the left side, you'll see the grades 1 through 5 science and social studies. And as I mentioned earlier, the kindergarten ones are embedded within the literature unit because that's the only block that they have here at Match. And so if we were, say we were interested in a first grade science and social studies unit and we clicked on that one there, you'll get taken to the home page. This particular course is still under construction, so you'll notice that there are 2 units that are not up here yet. But on every course homepage, there's a course summary that explains how the entire year worth of units builds together. We think that it's important that there's cohesive themes that drive the entire year, not just the individual units. So you'll see that there are themes in terms of the social studies units and themes in terms of the science units. And so then on the right side of the screen, you'll see the different units, then their lengths. And if you clicked on one, we'll click on the biographies. When you're launched to the biographies website, when you click on the biographies, you'll see some of the same. There's a unit summary that explains why this unit is important, all the core text that you need in order to teach the unit, the assessment that comes along with it, and then the standards that go with it, everything that goes into sort of the planning behind it and what is included in the unit. And then we include a section on unit prep, which we're going to dive into in a second. And then we also have the lessons on here. So within all of our materials, the philosophy that we've talked about in this first section really come to life and build strong informational readers. So switching back to our slide deck, one of the things that we believe here at Match is that teaching and preparing to teach a unit we call it intellectual prep here, is a very important part of being able to execute and deliver strong reading instruction. Our units and lessons on Match Fishtank are deliberately skinny, as we call them. We have provided the frameworks for strong units that include the summary, the text, the lesson plans, and the lesson frames, but there is a level of work and ownership on the teacher's end in terms of internalizing it and making it their own. We have found that when things sometimes when things are over-scripted or not scripted enough, that the unit doesn't necessarily progress in the desired way. And so we think that the amount of information we provide paired with strong internalization and planning leads to lessons and units that help kids meet our goal of both becoming better readers and building their background knowledge. So we're going to talk through how to prepare to teach a unit, and we'll see sort of through that the strategies that we use to make sure the strategies we use to support teachers in supporting their kids become better informational readers. So the first part of this is this intellectual prep piece. And that sort of starts with reading the unit summary and thinking about like, why is this unit important and why would I want to teach this to my kids? And there's always 2 pieces in that. There's the content knowledge of like, why does this content knowledge matter? And then there's also the piece of how will they develop as readers? And so with that framing, we then go into the process of intellectual prep. And so these are our things that are involved in intellectual prep, and I'm going to show you what these look like on the different on the website, so you have a sense of how you could use the materials to help intellectually prep for a unit. So we are currently in a first grade unit on biographies, that you can be whatever you want to be. And this particular, since we didn't have a chance to read the unit prep, the unit summary, this particular unit is focused on teaching about artists, musicians, and dancers and their motivations. And the unit really focuses on how they have shown hard work and determination and how they've had to overcome obstacles. And for many of them, the obstacles involve some amount of prejudice and discrimination. So it helps the kids see the challenges and connect with challenges and talk about artists, musicians, and dancers that they may not already be familiar with. So in preparing for this particular unit, or any unit, there's always a section called intellectual prep. We find this to be incredibly important. There's two parts to it: building background knowledge and then internalizing the text and standards. Building background knowledge, of course, is optional to the depth in which you want to engage with this. But for this particular unit, the background knowledge that's necessary is that you actually understand the artists and are able to answer questions about the artists, and that before you go into the unit, you understand the content yourself. And also in this particular unit, there are some texts that will require discussions about racial discrimination and injustice. And we have found that preparing for those discussions is incredibly important. So in every single unit, when there is something like that shows up, the background knowledge it will be highlighted in the building background knowledge. And then in the internalizing text and standards, this is also where we give guidance on other things that should be done in order to make sure that the teacher is ready to teach the unit. So you'll notice it's like taking the unit assessment and writing an exemplar scholar response, reading all of the texts and making sure you're familiar with the text, brainstorming projects, thinking about a habit of discussion. And so by going through all of those steps, it ensures that before you get in front of the kids to teach, you have a solid understanding of what it is you're expecting from the kids throughout the unit. The next piece of this is the essential questions. Every unit has essential questions. The essential questions are the overarching guiding questions that make it that frame the unit and are constantly being referred back to. And this is what helps keep the unit cohesive, so that it's not just every day we're reading a different biography, but we're connecting it back to how did this person's decisions change his or her life? How does that compare to the other biographies we've learned? How can we connect this to our own life? And so across all of our units, the essential questions are what go back to that initial importance of building content knowledge and getting kids to think critically, because by the end of the unit, they should have a very different answer to the essential question than they did at the beginning of the unit if we have fully taught the content knowledge. Underneath the essential questions, there's a content knowledge and connection section. So this is where we highlight the content knowledge that students will learn within the unit. In this particular unit on biographies, there are a lot of different artists and musicians and dancers that the kids are introduced to. We would not necessarily expect the kids have memorized every single one of these at the end of the unit, but that kids have connected with 4 or 5 of them and feel very passionately about Jose Limon because maybe they're into dancing, or they feel very passionate about Diego Rivera because they connected with his type of art. And so in each unit, we identify the content knowledge, and by the end of the unit, kids should be able to articulate and explain those concepts if we have taught the unit well. And then the next part underneath this is the vocabulary, and we pull out all the vocabulary words, and this goes with our before, where we talked about the importance of vocabulary. At the end of all the units, we want the kids to be familiar with and have interacted with these vocabulary words. Same with the content knowledge. We don't expect that the kids have memorized every single vocabulary word, but the kids have held on to and become familiar with and internalized the vocabulary words that are most relevant and important to them. And then the last thing that we see in intellectual prep is the writing focus areas. And so we at Match believe that one of the best tools for comprehension is to write about reading. And so in our kindergarten through fifth grade classrooms, kids write in response to the text every single day. And as the units progress, the teaching points and the feedback that we give to students progresses as well, so that kids are becoming better writers. So in this particular first grade unit, you'll see that they're working on correctly answering the question, and that's what the teachers are giving feedback on. So that all of that stuff goes into our intellectual prep in terms of thinking about all of this and making sure that going into the unit, before we even look at the lessons, these are the things that we understand about the unit. Because the lessons are skinny, this stuff we need to understand in order to make sure that there is cohesion and make sure that everything sticks together over the course of the unit. So once we had a chance to do the intellectual prep and sort of internalize the unit, and as a teacher familiarize ourselves with the content and the big picture, that is when we jump into lesson planning. At Match, all of our teachers, before they teach a unit, spend an hour doing with their instructional leaders, doing the unit internalization that we just talked about together as a group, and then they move into the lesson planning. So the way that we lesson plan at Match, and to make sure that kids are building their informational reading strategies, is that we take a couple steps. The first step is that we we look at the objective, the reading and the materials, and the target task. So in front of you, you'll see that for this particular lesson, the objective was to explain how Marion showed courage and overcame prejudice by describing the connection between events and ideas in a text. And then the target task question, the ultimate question we want them to be able to answer at the end of the lesson, is how did Marion show courage and overcome prejudice? And why do you think she never gave up on her dream? And so thinking about all that, and then the link standards are RI 1.3, which is describing the connection between two individuals and events. And then thinking about, so I'm reading this and I'm thinking, okay, these are the things that the kids need to know at the end of the lesson. And so from there, what we do is we recommend that teachers read the entire text and think about the entire text from the lens of the objective, the target task, and the link standards. That way, we think it's important to read the entire text so that the teacher is able to figure out what reading strategies and what content are necessary for kids to master the target task at the end of the day. So in this particular lesson, I would be reading the text through the lens of how did Marion show courage and overcome prejudice. And I would be, as a teacher, I would be thinking about what key points in the text do kids need to know. For our 3rd through 5th grade classrooms, we annotate in the text. And so we would, as the teacher, would be making the key annotations in our own text of what would we expect kids to annotate for if they were going to answer the target task question. And so that sort of has two purposes. One, it helps the teacher know what to drive for, but it also helps them then prepare to give feedback to the kids because they've already gone through the text in their own lens and annotated things that they think are important. So once we have read the objective, the target task, and the link standards, we always create an exemplar student response. We think it is incredibly important to know where we are headed and what an ideal response is before we head into the lesson so that we can push students in the right direction. It's often very easy to go into a lesson, and if there's not a clear view of where you want them to go, it can get sidetracked very quickly, or the activities and steps and process that we take for the lesson doesn't necessarily get us to the ultimate goal. So writing the exemplar response gets us to thinking about what is it that we want kids to get by the end of the lesson. And so it also allows us to anticipate misconceptions and figure out what additional background knowledge kids may need in order to access the content that they're going to be taught that day. And so for this particular example, since this is a first grade example, this written response would be a response we would expect more in a discussion, and then the slightly lower, or the version that kids would write might not be quite as coherent and like descriptive, but would get at the same ideas. In third and fourth grade and fifth grade, most of the exemplar responses that we write are from the lens of what a student would be able to do, so that the teacher can jump into the student's mindset and think about what they would need to know. So then once we've read our objective or target task, we've done our reading of the text, and we've thought about an exemplar response, that is when we jump into the nitty-gritty of lesson planning. What would this actually look like so that we can develop our readers? So at Match and with this curriculum, we've envisioned this being taught sort of through a hybrid of readers workshop and interactive read aloud lessons. For those of you who aren't quite as familiar, Readers Workshop is more where you teach a teaching point about what a good reader does, and then have kids practice using that teaching point. And interactive read alouds are when you're asking comprehension questions in order to deeply interact with the text and build a deeper understanding of the text. And so we have sort of wed the two, because we think it's important to teach kids the strategies within these texts, but it's also important for them to deeply understand the text and get the content knowledge out of the text, not just practice doing cause and effect, or not just practice finding main idea. It's more about the bigger picture. So for example, a strategy in a fourth grade classroom could be that good readers annotate cause and effect in order to understand how events happen. And so they might go through, and the focus of the teaching point at the beginning would be like, okay, a lot of my annotations are gonna focus on cause and effect, but that's not the only focus of this lesson. We're also needing to think about what content needs to be mastered. So they are understanding cause and effect, but they're also thinking about, in the example of Marian Anderson, they're also thinking about the challenge she had to face, like where she faced discrimination, and the fact that she wasn't allowed to do a lot of things because of the color of her skin, because the story took place in a time pre the civil rights movement. So the focus for my lesson is knowing that I need to go into this lesson thinking about cause and effect, but also making sure the kids at the end of the lesson know that what Marian Anderson struggled with as she was trying to become a singer. So once I have the focus, then I think about what I want to do before reading. And what needs to be included in the book preview. And so not all of these things need to be included every single day. The book preview should take no more than 5 minutes, so that kids are able to get right into the text. This is not about teachers talking and explaining everything that they're going to get in the text. We want them to get it from the text, not from the teacher. But there are some things that we need to do to set kids up for success, to access the text in a way that they can build their background knowledge and build their understanding. So if there's key vocabulary that kids need to know, we've suggested it in the lesson frames online, but it's also, teachers should say, okay, this is a word that kids need to know and they're not gonna get right out of context, so I'm gonna introduce this before the lesson. Or the teacher may decide, nope, this isn't included in the book preview, I'm gonna get this, they'll get this through the reading the text, because the vocabulary word comes up so many times that they don't need to access it at that point. And it's also important to think about that through the lens of, if you're introducing vocabulary too soon, how much of the cognitive demand you're taking off of kids. So if you're introducing a vocabulary word to them that is the key word from the entire text, by introducing that word at the beginning, have you made it so that they no longer have to think about the target task question? So we like to frame to our teachers that you introduce the word if it's a word that they need to know but isn't necessarily the most important word, and we try and get our kids to figure out the other ones through the context of the text. Something else that we include in a book preview is tricky content previewing. I think this is especially true in a lot of our social studies lessons, where the book talks about things that kids may not necessarily be familiar with and they need to understand before reading a book. So for example, with Marian Anderson, if the kids had no understanding of the civil rights movement, or if they had no understanding of discrimination, or if they had no understanding why it was such a big deal that Marian Anderson overcame this challenge and was able to sing in a stadium with one of the first African American women to sing in this particular music hall, they wouldn't necessarily understand the power of that particular text. And so before reading that text, we would need to preview that with kids and leave some sort of space, if this is also their first introduction to segregation and discrimination, leave some sort of space to preview that in a way that is appropriate for a first grader. And so I think it's knowing your kids and knowing what your kids have learned about before and then previewing that. And again, that wouldn't necessarily happen with every single lesson. That only happens where it helps kids deeply understand the content. Then the next part of this is setting the focus for the lesson, which we've already done in the previously. Our focus would be on cause and effect, or would be on deeply knowing Marian Anderson, and then sharing that with kids. So we would say to them, like, today we're going to learn about Marian Anderson and what she did to show courage, and we're going to do that by using cause and effect. And then also a big part of this is connecting to previous lessons and unit essential questions. The lessons cannot be taught in isolation. If we actually want to build this cohesive informational content understanding where kids are building their knowledge from day to day, it has to happen in a way where kids are pushed to build on their knowledge from day to day. And so that can either happen in the before reading, in the after reading, but there needs to be some sort of connection to help kids think that through, because for a lot of kids, it's not necessarily natural to go back to what they learned the next day. And so that needs to be facilitated at some point in the before reading. And so we think that all of these structures don't all need to be used at the same time, but are structures that set kids up for success when they're going to read an informational text. And so then from there, we dig into what are the class structures that the teacher will use to help kids meet our goals of learning the content knowledge, and also meet our goals of practicing their reading strategy. So one of the most important things to think about is how the text will be consumed. We at Match believe that the text should be consumed in various different ways depending on the demands of the text. And so in kindergarten and first grade and second grade, that's most often an interactive read aloud. But then what we do during that interactive read aloud should vary depending on the demands of that text. In second, third, and fourth grade, there is still a place for read aloud in modeling fluent reading and guiding kids in close reads. But we also think there's times where partner reading is incredibly important, and where kids should be reading with others and grappling with the text together and having a chance to talk about the content as a way of deepening their understanding. We also find that small group instruction is incredibly important. We often find in some of our classrooms where kids are reading below grade level and our teachers say the kids can't access the core text. How do we make this content accessible to them without just teaching them the content? We also want to be teaching them the reading strategies. And so we really push small group reading instruction where the teachers will pull kids, while the other kids are in partner reading or in independent reading, will pull kids to do some more small group. And so our teachers choose from how it's going to be consumed. And in some lessons, you might walk into a classroom and see some of each in every single lesson, because it's entirely dependent on the demands of the text from that day. And then after that, they think about how the key strategies will be introduced and reinforced. And so do they want to include a think aloud? Should there be a mini lesson? Should there be a close read? Should they include a turn and talk? Should they do a stop and jot? Should there be some annotation? And so we are, in our lower grades and all of our grades, we look at We include a think aloud as a way of sort of modeling to kids, or a mini lesson as a way of modeling to kids. But again, those are no more than 5 to 7 minutes at most, because we think the heart of students learning is by deeply grappling with the text and getting feedback from the teacher. And so turn and talks and stop and jots, we put those in when there is something meaty and meaningful for kids to interact with within the text. And so in that particular, when Marian Anderson sang book, we would turn and talk at a point where there's a cause and effect, something related to cause and effect, which supports this understanding of how she showed courage. And then in our 3rd through 5th grade classrooms, as I mentioned before, annotation guides the majority of how key strategies are introduced and reinforced. Our scholars annotate in all of their texts, both in literature and informational, and the teachers circulate to give feedback on annotation to show their understanding. We do not believe in formulaic annotation. We believe that annotation should be based on how kids make sense of the key strategies. So no 2 kids' annotations would look exactly the same. They may have both pulled out the same cause and effect moment, but they are making sense of that cause and effect moment in a way that makes sense for them. And then with that, we also think about what key questions support the lesson focus. So online, you'll notice that we've pulled out a lot of the key questions that that people to support the lesson. And so you can use all of those questions, you can use some of those questions, depending on what you want the focus of the lesson to be. And they're just sort of there to help guide and narrow the thinking in terms of what could happen during that lesson. The key thing here is that the class structures should vary based on the kids in front of you, the text in front of you, and the goal of the unit in terms of the content knowledge that you want kids to learn. And so the ownership is on the teachers to sort of think about what this looks like and how which strategy best meets their goals. And then after that is when we jump into the after reading. And so this again is a really important part of making sense of the information. And so this is often where kids are challenged through a class discussion to synthesize what they have learned and synthesize what they've learned with their team and with the other people in their class, so that they can build a deeper understanding of content. We also believe in extended writing. Our kids do a lot of writing in response to the text, and we use that writing either as to write before discussion or write after a discussion, and the teacher circulates to make sure the kids are able to articulate their understandings both orally and in writing, because for some kids the oral articulation comes often before they're able to write about it. We also do a lot of debates where kids are forced to look at 2 sides and challenge it based on what they have learned so far. And we believe that one of those 4 should be involved every day after reading, and those are less focused on the reading strategies and more focused on the content knowledge. But they would have needed to use the reading strategy, for example, of cause and effect, to be able to understand the content in a way that they could write for an extended time about the target task question. And then we always end with some sort of close to the lesson that connects the lesson back to the larger themes of the unit. So in this particular example, when we talked about when Marian Anderson sang, we might end the lesson by having them think back about like how were her challenges similar to someone else we've learned about in this unit. And so that gives a chance for students to tap back into their memory and think about, oh, who are the other people we've learned about and what do I remember about their experiences, so that they can hold on to that content knowledge and it's not just day to day. And then also thinking about ways that you can spark kids to think about how the lesson prepares scholars for tomorrow's lesson. So in Marian Anderson example, again, like they read half the text on this particular day. So the second part, it could be some sort of connection to think about like, oh, what else might, based on what we've learned from everyone else, what other challenges might she face? What else might she overcome in order to reach her goals and overcome prejudice and show courage the way that they were thinking about in the target task. And again, these class structures, not every one of them would happen every day. They're based on the needs of the kids and based on the demands of that particular text. So all of this is to say, before we get into that, all this is to say, just to summarize all of this, I think we believe here at Match that teaching content, teaching reading through systematic units and focused on content knowledge is the most powerful way of teaching kids to become better readers. And so we fully believe that in exposing them to a wide variety of content knowledge with the support of how to become better readers will accelerate their reading growth from a very young age. We also believe, as you can see in this second section, we believe that the teacher preparation and internalization is incredibly important, and that teachers should go into the lesson have a very clear vision for what they're looking for from their kids, both in terms of content knowledge and reading strategies, and that helps build informational reading skills. And then we also believe that what we are providing on Fishtank in terms of our free resources are the frames in terms of setting up this sort of process in which teachers can begin the process of teaching cohesive units to kids and through teaching reading strategies and informational reading to the scholars or kids in front of them. So that sort of wraps up our presentation on how we approach informational reading and our resources on Match Fishtank. So we would love to open it up if anyone has any questions based on the things that we've talked about. And so we'll give everyone about 2 minutes to type in some questions, and then we'll respond to those questions. Sorry, we've had a moment of technical difficulty as some of our questions have come in, so I apologize for the moment of silence. We've had a lot of great questions, and we're going to try our best to answer them. But if we can't get to all of them today and you've asked us a question, we'll reach back out to you to make sure you can get the answer to the question that you have asked. One of the questions that we were able to see was, what's the difference between content and background knowledge, or do they mean the same thing? And yes, these are two words that I sort of used hand in hand over the course of the presentation. And so background knowledge, we are building background knowledge. And so we are teaching content in order to build background knowledge. And so if a kid has done a unit on insects, by the end of that particular unit and they've learned all of that content, then that content turns into background knowledge, in which when they access the text later, they will be able to use what they have learned about insects in order to interact with a text. So the content and background knowledge sort of go hand in hand based on the depth in which scholars have internalized the material that they are learning. So it looks like we are unable to see the rest and respond to the rest of the questions right now. But if you did ask us a question, we will find a way to get back in touch with you to answer that question. So thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.